So here's a strange thing about me. Every November, I basically think of it as Lord of the Rings time. For me, there's a strong association between kind of the warmth of the hearth of Thanksgiving and hobbits and kind of the warmth and beauty of the Lord of the Rings. And so every year I rewatch them, right? I cook foods that I think are hobbity. And so this year, in rewatching them, I was thinking, here's something really interesting that I hadn't thought about before. And it's specifically in regards to the Hobbit trilogy, right? Um, so that's what I want to talk with you about today. I had never really thought about how very different the Hobbit films are from the novel, insofar as there's a key difference in that Azog the Defiler is the principal antagonist, or one of the principal antagonists of the film. And he doesn't play the same role in the novel. And he's depicted very differently and very specifically in the Hobbit trilogy, in this Hobbit film series. And so what I thought was really interesting about it is he's presented as this giant white orc. And I started to think about it and I realized, wow, so we have Thorin, who is obsessed with finding him and killing him and getting even with him. And then you have this larger than normal orc who happens to have this pale quality, this pale orc. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute, that's Moby Dick, right? That's the giant whale, the giant white whale, Moby Dick, after whom Captain Ahab drives his ship and his crew to insanity to try and kill. Now, of course, there's a lot of other nuance there, that Thorin is trying to get their home back, right? That he's trying to get the Arkenstone and all of those other things, 100%. But the fatal flaw of Thorin is always obsession, whether it's obsession with the Arkenstone or a Golden General, but also with Azog. And it leads him to his doom, right? It leads him to his death. Now, we don't know for sure, had he not kind of drove himself mad, right? If the Arkenstone hadn't and the dragon sickness had not come upon him, he might have still been killed by Azog. But it's nevertheless, to me, a really interesting parallel in that you also have the loss of a limb, right? So Captain Ahab famously has lost his leg to the orc, but in this case, to the orc, pardon me, Captain Ahab lost his leg to the whale. And in this particular case, the whale has lost its arm, right? This orc, Azog, has lost his arm to Thorin. And so it kind of inverts this a little bit. So to me, what you end up actually seeing is what happens when the whale is as obsessed with you as you are with the whale. And I think that that's just brilliant. The realization kind of becomes that in Moby Dick, right? In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Captain Ahab is obsessed, because he lost his leg to this whale, with killing this whale. It's not about the money. It's not about glory. It's about just vengeance. It's just pure vengeance, right? We're told, like, had his chest been a mortar, had his chest been a cannon, he would have shot his hot heart shell upon it, right? Like that he would have given his own heart, like, to his death, right? Like if he could have, you're throwing the kitchen sink at someone, well, you're taking your heart out and throwing it at them too. That this is how much he hated it. He piled upon the whale's white hump the sum of all of the hate and rage felt by his whole race from Adam down. That this is how much he hates this thing, right? And the comedy of it is that, and I think the language of it in Moby Dick is that, well, it's supposed to be a dumb beast, right? It's just a dumb beast. It's just an animal. It doesn't understand. Now, there's always this kind of question of, like, does Moby Dick actually understand a little bit? Is Moby Dick actually kind of messing with Ahab? Does he know? Does Moby Dick know? And I think that that's an excellent point. But even so, Moby Dick isn't like tromping around trying to find Ahab, right? It's Ahab who drives himself to insanity, drives his crew to death to try and get this whale that did him harm. So what the Hobbit does is it turns it on its head just a little bit. So what if I have someone who's obsessed with getting vengeance, but the object of vengeance is also obsessed with getting vengeance on you? And I think that that kind of closes the loop that's begun by Moby Dick, by the novel. But what I mean is that there's vengeance is always a cycle, right? That vengeance is not something that you can acquire and then go, okay, we're even now. So I've got my vengeance on you. Now we're done, right? Okay, you took away, you killed my dad. I've cut off your arm. We're good. Doesn't work that way, right? I get even with you. I've made you pay your costs. You're like, no, that's not even. Now it's uneven. And now I have to get even with you. But from my perspective, it's not going to be even. It's uneven. And so we kind of just go around in a circle and a circle and a circle until we die. And that's gestured towards by the end of Moby Dick. But in The Hobbit, they fill out the rest of the details for us about that, where they point out to us, here it is. This is what happens. This is the end result, is when you get even, the other person is going to be as obsessed with getting even with you. And so I think that there's also parallels insofar as, notice that the ending battle happens on the sea in a certain sense. In other words, when Thorin and Azog are fighting, they're fighting on the ice, which is like they're two ships, right? On the water. It's very little, it's very on the nose, right? But then Azog is actually under the water, like a whale, right? And he is stabbing at Thorin from the sea again, right? From the water, so to speak. And yeah, I know it's not the actual sea, but nevertheless, you get the metaphor and how kind of literalized that metaphor actually is. And so in the end, right, they kill each other. And what are you left with? Well, like in Moby Dick, you're left with Ishmael, right? Bilbo. Bilbo is the teller of this story, right? And really, it is his narrative. He's the one who's writing. It's like, call me Ishmael. And the narrative begins with his description of hobbits, right? In other words, it's a self-identifier. Well, what happens to Ishmael? Well, if you haven't read Moby Dick, and I highly recommend that you do, I don't want to give the whole narrative away, but you have a pretty good sense of it. But one thing I can say, whether it happens literally or not, Ishmael is very dead by the end of Moby Dick, whether it's literal or not. And what I mean is, for those of you who have read it or know the narrative, you know that there's a coffin involved, right? So Ishmael, whether literal or not, right, engages in this having to deal with being dead. And I think that Bilbo does also. What I mean is that he radically changes and radically shifts. I think it's symbolized by when we see him going back and he's got the shield on him, and there's always this gesture towards like kind of come home with your shield or on it, right? To be on your shield is to be dead, right? You see people laid to rest like on their shields or with their shields on them. So he's got it on his back, and to me that is somewhat symbolic of his having changed so much that the previous Bilbo is dead. What's more evidence of that? He gets back, in essence, to his own funeral, right? People are selling his stuff. He's at his own estate sale. All of his stuff is gone. His home is emptied out. He is not the same hobbit that he was. The Bilbo who left has died, and a new Bilbo has taken place, right? Call me Ishmael. Call me Bilbo, right? And so, like Ishmael, right, there is this gesture towards death. So one thing that certainly comes to my mind is if these are actually connected or somehow mirror or parallel narratives, how really critical we probably need to be of Thorin. In other words, Captain Ahab, at the end of the day, was willing to sacrifice all of his people, right? It didn't matter what happened to them in order to gain his vengeance, to acquire his ends. And you might say, well, wait a minute, but Thorin's people love him. Well, it's important to note that Ahab's people did too, that they were caught in his infection in a certain sense, that they were willing to follow him into his madness, that his obsession with Moby Dick became their obsession with Moby Dick. And I think you actually see something very similar with Thorin. Now, by the end of the film series, right, by the very, very end, Thorin is to some degree redeemed, right? He apologizes to Bilbo. He talks about how he was wrong. But I think what we kind of fail to notice is how similar Thorin is to Azog. And I think making Azog also obsessed with Thorin, right? It's kind of this idea of making the whale also obsessed with you. It puts a clear mirror in front of Thorin. It makes Thorin and Azog very similar. And they are both people who drive their followers to death and grief and loss and madness. That parallel is one that The Hobbit makes much more clearly than Moby Dick honestly could. And perhaps it's maybe a little bit too on the nose, but it's also an important one. The impact that Ahab has on his crew is important. And the impact that Thorin has on his followers is important, right? This isn't just a matter of one man's obsession, right? Or one orc's obsession. There's all of their soldiers, all of their legions, all of the people who follow them, all of the people who are moved by them and die as a result. And so I think that a healthy analysis of it, yeah, considers Thorin's redemption, but also considers the fact that if he is being made a parallel to Ahab, if he's being made somewhat similar to Azog, if we can see the similarities between the two, then that's an important reminder that obsession isn't just dangerous for us, and vengeance isn't just dangerous for us. It's dangerous for all of the people around us. That we can become megalomaniacal. That we can become the kinds of people that other people will follow to their deaths, and that's not necessarily a good thing.
So this similarity between Azog and Thorin that is reminiscent of Moby Dick, but also brings out this reciprocal hate. Like, what if the whale hunted you too? Reminds me of a famous quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, right? That you've heard before. It goes along the lines of, be careful of when you hunt monsters, that you don't become one. When you stare into the abyss also stares into you. And to me, it's a lot of it's very obvious. It's a warning that the emotions and the actions that it takes to hunt the things that you view as monstrous, you spend your time in those emotional states that you start becoming the thing that you claim to hate. And it's also a reminder of perspective, right? That from your perspective, you're clearly seeing the monster. From the monster's perspective, you are clearly the monster. You're the thing that's exhibiting the behavioral traits that you claim make the monster worth hunting. And the idea of staring into the abyss and there's something staring back into you, this can mean a lot of things. A lot of people have kind of argued about what it meant. But I think in the context of this film series and understanding in the context of Moby Dick, what you realize is the abyss is a state in which things do not matter. I think that there's a lot to say about the similarity between Thorin and Azog, right? Issues of vengeance and hatred and, mania and so on and so forth. But really the point where their similarity becomes the most dangerous and the most concerning is when you realize that Thorin is not caring about the people who care about him. And that is the similarity to Azog that I think is the most terrifying, right? The fact that they're both engaged in violence and that they're, both willing to do violence to achieve their ends. Well, we tend to have some forgiveness for this, right? We view it as sometimes necessary in wartime, etc. But there's a point when Thorin no longer seems to care about the well-being of those who are closest to him, right? There's other dwarves who are dying in this battle, and it doesn't matter, right? His relationship with Bilbo doesn't matter. His relationship with his family doesn't matter. He's completely isolated himself towards his own ends and his own desires. And that's very similar Azog, who's willing to, throw other orcs into the void just to achieve, again, his own ends and his own vengeance. That the tunnel vision that of things like greed and now vengeance aren't just a matter of the obsession with the thing, but also the way in which they isolate you from the things that um, make you part of a community, make you part of a group of people that care. That the abyss staring into you and the abyss entering you, right? That single-minded obsession is that problem of basically kind of becoming a zombie, right? Consequences no longer matter. The people who love you no longer matter. The people you love no longer matter. What matters is just this thing. And so I think that that's very smart. I think that for a film that is not as beloved, or a film series that is not as beloved as The Lord of the Rings, and one that there's a lot of criticism thrown their way, that they really do a great job of capturing that idea of becoming that which you seek to hunt. And they capture, I think, some very nice kind of touches towards and hint towards Moby Dick, and then ask the question, what if it was also hunting you? To me, that's all very smart and fun, and I enjoyed it. So I hope you enjoyed this conversation today, and uh, that you take the opportunity, if you did enjoy it, to please like and subscribe. Comment, it helps. If you didn't like it, if you thought it was silly, by all means comment as well. I would try to respond, and share it with other people, right? Let them know, ask them to subscribe if they enjoy it as well. And thank you so much. I hope you have a great holiday season.